Okay, so we have implemented user entity class, and we should be able to use this class to persist data into a database. But before we can do that, we will need to create a repository class, which will take this user entity class and will persist the data into a database. So I'm going to create a new user repository class, and I'm going to click on root package and then new, and that's actually going to be not a class but an interface. And since it will be responsible for working with user details, like save user details, update user details, or delete user details, I will call it user repository. And this interface will need to extend another very important interface, and it's called CRUD repository. So I'll filter interfaces by a keyword, and this is the repository that we need to extend, and click on OK. And then click on Finish. And here we go, we have public interface user repository that extends CRUD repository. If I were not using Spring Data GPA, I would most likely have to create a data access object class, and then for each CRUD operation, like create, read, update, and delete, I'll have to create a separate method, and then write business logic that will open database connection and then perform SQL query and then close database connection. Or I'll have to add methods that use Hibernate. And again, for each operation, I would have to create a separate method that creates or reads or updates records. With Spring Data GPA, it is all much easier. Instead of creating data access object, we simply create user repository, and then we make it extend the CRUD repository, which enables us to call a ready-to-use methods. Like save user details is already done for us. All we need to do is call this method and pass it an entity object, which we are going to have user entity, to save whatever user entity contains into a database. All we need to do is to call the method which has been provided to us and give it a user entity object to save it. This is why this CRUD repository is generic, and we need to provide a couple of details here. The first one is the class of the object that needs to be persisted, and in our case this is user entity. And the second one is the data type of ID field. In our case ID is a long, so I will provide long. Now I'll need to save this and import user entity. And I will need to add one more annotation to make it a true repository, and that annotation is called repository. And let me import it. And here we go. So we don't actually need to provide any methods in this repository to be able to save, read, update, and delete. But if you want to add custom implementations of some of the methods, like for example, find user by public user ID, or delete user by public user ID, or add user by, let's say, email address, then we can simply define these methods here. Like for example, let's define a method that finds user by email address, and this method will of course need to return user entity once a record is found. So we will provide a return type user entity, and then the method name find user by, let's say, email address, and we will provide an argument for this method. Let's make it a string value email address. And this is it. Now, additionally to create user, read user, update user, and delete user, we have a method that's called find user by email address, and it will work. And if it sounds a little bit like a magic, then don't worry much at this time, because once we start using it will all make sense. The purpose of the Spring Data GPA framework was to make it very easy for us to use it and to work with the database. This is why they have created for us a ready-to-use methods to create, read, and update, and a very convenient way to find a record in the users table by a field which is called email address. If that field was called differently, we would have to provide not email, but let's say first name or last name here. So the framework makes it very easy. As we go on through this course, we will add more methods, like we will add a method to find user by public user ID and to delete user by public user ID. And as we are going to be adding more methods, you will get a better idea of how this all works. At this time, we're still at the very beginning, and to be able to save a simple dummy user details into a database, an interface that extends CRUD repository and is annotated with repository annotation is enough. So we don't really need to have this method here. So I'll delete it and let's continue to the next video.